Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of Intercultural Insiders. My name is John McGraw, and I am the founder of Hyaku Coaching. And I help expats and newcomers feel confident in their new country in less time and pain. The purpose of Intercultural Insiders is to share the stories of people with intercultural experiences. So if you're feeling isolated or lost, you can hopefully hear something from the guests' experiences that could help you, even if it's just a reminder that you're not alone. And as you know, those of you who've been watching, today is part 2 of the interview with filmmakers Kennedy Kao and Tomo Nogi. But I have a couple of updates, as I always do, before we get into that. So just yesterday, I ran a workshop for Beehive, which is a startup incubator in Brampton, which helps immigrants wanting to start new businesses, their new lives in Canada. And the participants in the Beehive incubator program are referred to as founders, of course, since they are the founders of these new startups. And I ran a workshop for the founders titled Cultural Adaptation: How to Thrive in a Canadian Business Environment. I used a number of techniques such as Philip Rosinski's Cultural Orientations Framework assessments to help raise their awareness around different cultural aspects, differences such as the way we communicate, how we form relationships, our feelings about personal space. And then we covered a number of topics, such as Canadian versus American approaches towards business development. And there's sometimes a belief that Canadians and Americans are essentially the same. And in fact, if you make that assumption, oftentimes that can be a costly mistake because there are some significant differences in decision making and how we go towards consensus and so on. So the differences are there. So it's important to be aware of them. And we also talked in general about differences in terms of forming business relationships across cultures, how comfortable we are in getting very personal, deep and personal. You may have remembered, for those of you who've seen other episodes, you may have seen that story that I gave about my experience working a business relationship with a potential collaborator from China, and how I had had some difficulties with that adjustment, with that approach in forming a business relationship. So we talked about that as well, and also how to improve your critical thinking to avoid making mistakes based on cultural biases, building your observation skills when you encounter new situations, and how to think of multiple explanations before jumping to a conclusion and making a judgment that could lead to, again, a costly mistake in a business situation and in personal situations as well. So I really enjoyed that session because, as I've mentioned before, I really like working with entrepreneurs because they, by nature, are willing to experiment and willing to try something new and go outside of their comfort zones to do what they need to do to make their businesses a success. And, well, adapting to a culture means getting outside of your comfort zone. So the founders who attended, they asked a lot of great questions and really got into the activities. And I was able to learn some things about their cultures as well. So it's always a great experience when there is cross-pollination and cross-cultural communication and learning. And Beehive was a great host for me. They invited me to stick around for lunch. And at the end, of course, they gave me a local gift, some raw honey sourced locally in Brampton from the Village Raw Local Honeybee Company. See, sometimes even I have difficulties with English. So that was a wonderful gift and just a fantastic session that I enjoyed, and looking forward to working with Beehive and the future founder cohorts as well. And another update about something that I mentioned last week is, of course, the course that I'm planning. I'm planning a 3-session live online cohort-based course called Newcomers: Build Great Relationships with Canadian Colleagues and Clients. And some of those ideas that will be going into that course are ones that I used in the workshop with the founders in Beehive yesterday. And there is a link to the survey and wait list for the course that's already in the comments for today's episode. And I can post that again later as well. And just a reminder that this course is for newcomers who are looking to strengthen their cross-cultural skills so they can thrive in their positions and advance in their careers. So we'll cover topics like understanding key aspects of Canadian work culture, advocating for yourself in a Canadian workplace, and building relationships to thrive in your position and advance in your career. So I'm looking forward to sharing this course. The details are still being ironed out, but I'm also having conversations with interested people who want to share their perspectives on what they would like to get out of the course. So please feel free to connect with me if you would like to have a conversation about that. I want to make sure that this course fits the needs of those who will be taking it. So again, you can reach out to me through LinkedIn if you're watching it here, or John McGraw at thriveglobally.ca, or go to my website, thriveglobally.ca, and make an appointment to connect with me and have a conversation. So, with that said, let's talk about today's interview, which is part 2 with Kennedy, Kao and Tomo Nogi, who are filmmakers and creators of the upcoming film Good Boy, which in fact, I believe at this point has started filming. It is about a Japanese university student in Toronto trying to fit in and find himself. And as I mentioned last week, it really touched a chord in me, really resonated with me because of that loss of identity, a concern about what he should or shouldn't be in a different culture. And I think anyone who's experienced loneliness and isolation will really find something in common with that. So in today's episode, we'll talk about our different cross-cultural experiences because we asked each other questions, talking about Kennedy and Tomo and how they worked together also with Japanese actors and the cross-cultural divide. They're working across cultures, which I think was a great a great example of cross-cultural cooperation. We get more into that as well. And you can find out more about the film at goodboyfilmproduction.com, which I'll share in the links as well. And also we talk a bit more about filmmaking culture and leadership styles and how they relate to corporate culture and differences in the ways of what a leader is or what a leader does. So, without further ado, and of course, I should mention that Kennedy and Tomo are both in the chat and LinkedIn Live and in YouTube. And yes, Tomo is also mentioning, of course, that he is confirming that we will start filming on the 6th of February. And they are also looking for extras who are Japanese speakers, I believe. So you can reach out to them as well, and we'll include the contact information again for their website. So without further ado, let's get into part 2 of the interview with Kennedy Kao and Tomo Nogi.
I kind of want to ask a question to John. Spent some time in Japan, and have you noticed any like a cultural behavioral differences, like how people behave differently in terms of like Western, Eastern way?
Yeah, that's a good question. For example, I'll bring it to the idea of the classroom teaching experience. When you're not sure of something, maybe given instructions, whether it's acceptable to say, hey, sorry, could you explain that again? Or if it's better for the purposes of preserving harmony to just go along with that and just I don't want to bring that up because it's just going to disrupt things. And that was a bit difficult for me to wrap my head around. You're supposed to say something if you don't understand these instructions. What's your reason? Are you just too proud or something? And that's one thing that stuck with me because of my own reactions to it, as well as what I was observing. When you have a better understanding of the culture, it does make sense.
The culturally appropriate behavior, particularly about how men are supposed to behave, I think it really depends on how your father was. Like my dad, he's basically a joker. He just always jokes around and my mom laughs. And that was my model for men. And I went to New Zealand and I was basically not trying to be my dad, but that was just the way I lived. And I couldn't get girlfriend. I couldn't have girlfriend at all. And one of my Vietnamese friends told me, Tomo, why don't you have a girlfriend? Because you joke around all the time. Men are supposed to gain some respect. So like even within the East, in that sense, there's a bit of a cultural behavior difference or the idea of how men are supposed to behave. That's something just came into my mind. I don't know because he said that because he's from that culture, or maybe his father was like that, or his friends were like that. I'm not sure. I just want to put it up there. And that's hugely why I relate to this character. I didn't have a official long-term girlfriend until very recently. I'm now 30 years old. There are so many things I can relate to this main character, Shinji, being unsure of where you're going or what to say, how to behave. Like at the same time, you have to be okay with it. That kind of like vague, unknown to yourself.
If I could just add on to that, I think Shinji's experiences in the film are relatable, whether you are a Japanese international student who studies at U of T or someone else, right? It's a very relatable experience. And I think in terms of how to act, how to be a quote unquote man in the West or in the East, whatever that means, right? In the film, he looks for love and it's a struggle for him because of how he behaves in certain scenarios. Maybe he's supposed to be more manly, how he's supposed to communicate through text, right? To women that he finds interest. And it's very much in the film what it means to be masculine and how people can struggle with those meanings, right? With those ideas. And I'm sure, John, with what you talked about and how maybe in Japan, it's common for people to hold in what they're really saying. Whereas in the West, it's the complete opposite, right? You're supposed to speak up for yourself. You're supposed to take charge, especially for guys, for men. And maybe that's something that Shinji is struggling with, right? So for sure, it all ties together.
Absolutely. And building off what both of you have said, it's not just a case of national culture. There's the culture based on the family and what your occupation is and generational culture. For myself, I'm Generation X. So the idea of what's appropriate for people, particularly men, to talk about in the West, it's influenced by parents, boomers, or silent generation, whereas now millennials and Generation Y, it's more acceptable, for example, when it comes to mental health. It's open when you talk about issues, and this is a very positive thing. So yeah, what you say about it being a universal theme, even though this particular film is focusing on this particular character from this particular background, the themes are definitely universal.
Kennedy's background is not Japanese. That's another interesting part that he picked this specific character. And he also doesn't understand Japanese language, but main characters would speak in Japanese, and that itself is already in process for me to again participate in. This is something I didn't really ask, and I don't think we spoke about, but if I may ask to Ken, two questions. One, was there any reason you chose Japanese background? And two, was there any time that you noticed cultural behavior differences in the East and West? I don't mean to take off John the authority.
No, hey, this is a three-way conversation. All the more the better.
Very good questions, Tomo. So I'll say that choosing a Japanese character comes from a personal reason. I had a lot of Japanese friends at U of T, but branching off of that, I do understand how in Japan there is a specific culture, a specific upbringing that I know a lot of my friends experience, and how that kind of upbringing and that kind of culture can be antithetical to the way of life in the West, right? In Canada. So that's conflict of cultural ideals, of cultural upbringings, I thought was a good way to depict the general struggle of someone struggling to fit into a new country, a new culture, because those differences were quite stark to me. And your second question, 100%, right? While I'd love to be specific about Japanese culture, I'm obviously not Japanese. I didn't live there, but broadly speaking, it's quite known that there are differences between the Eastern way of life and the Western way of life. I'm half Filipino, I'm half Taiwanese, so I definitely grew up in an Asian household. And so I experienced a lot of family kind of ideals, right? Thinking of the family first rather than your own independent journey. There was a lot of respect to authority. I was urged to not speak up too much or not to get in other people's way and to stay in my lane, right? Perhaps this can be found too in Japanese culture, at least just through observation. I do definitely see that. And obviously I was born and raised in Canada, right? And so growing up, and trying to balance or find my way through these conflicts of ideals.
Yeah, I can see that. Since you brought up that you don't have direct experience in Japan, but you're working with Japanese actors and producer Tomo, so I'm curious how the creative process is and how that works.
It's a really fun experience for me, right? I've never worked in another language other than English, so this is a new experience for me. I tend to give the actors a lot of space to riff off of each other and to ad-lib, right? And to really own their dialogue. I tend to do that with my films in general, but definitely emphasizing that for this film because I'm not Japanese. I don't know the kind of nuances of the language that Tomo or the actors would know. So trusting them and letting them guide me over a certain line or a certain behavior thing, right? It's definitely just trusting my team and letting them be creatives, right? Letting them be artists as well.
And to support that, we've been doing October rehearsal and also practice. We call it chemistry read. And also Kennedy does spend a lot of time with actors to develop characters, background story. We see the pages of the background story of the characters and you see it like, oh, this is nuts. Like, stack of pages. It's very interesting to see. And that builds a trust between actors and team and director. And it's surprising to see how language barrier can be so minimized by spending time together. It's pretty cool.
It's really interesting to hear that discussion of that kind of collaborative process, because it's a real culture change, I think, not just in film, but in business as well. And the difference between a boss and a leader. I'm sure you've heard of that. A boss just tells people what to do, but a leader, there's a communication there, whether it's your actors, the people who report to you in a corporation. There's so much more that comes out of that.
Just looking from the side, I think Kennedy knows where he wants to go, but he explores and then eventually gets there. And of course, that maybe the final vision can be changed through the process. But it's really interesting to see. He does spend a lot of time with his crew as well. In a different project, he sent text to different crew members before the shoot.
Maybe I should explain that I wanted the crew to be actually involved in the film, not just in terms of being behind the scenes, but actually being almost in front of the camera and participating in the shoot, because the whole shoot was very run and gun. It was shot on location in a restaurant, in a live location with real customers coming in. And so I wanted the crew who was in the restaurant to blend in with everyone else. And so as Tomo said, I love coming up with backstories for all my characters. And so I came up with little backstories for the crew. I sent each of them a little paragraph, and each paragraph basically said what I thought they did the day of or the morning of, and had them really participate. And I guess this all just goes to say that filmmaking is supposed to be collaborative. I just think it's best that everyone is involved as much as possible and that people are given the space to be creative and to be artists. I always liken the role of the director as a referee, meaning that it's up to me as a director to set rules, basically the guidelines being my creative vision, but it's essentially my job to let people to play, right? And to let people have fun at the end of the day. And then maybe if someone's going out of bounds, I'd steer them back onto the playing field. Kind of mentality I always like to have for making films, especially the case here, because I'm not Japanese. I need to trust the people that I'm working with who are Japanese.
Right. Yeah. You are not a teacher. You are a director.
And I think we talked about this, John, like over dinner, right? It's similar to what you do and how you specifically label yourself as a coach, right? Not a teacher, not someone who will give a prescription, right? But just being that kind of supportive force for your clients, right?
Which really resonates with me. I've also heard it explained as rather than being the sage on the stage, you're the guide on the side, right?
Yeah.
I think we're coming up pretty close to the time. Are there any other things that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to focus on?
We're going to be filming Good Boy in February, but before we start filming, and we have a GoFundMe page set up. We're looking to supplement our budget. We received a grant from the Toronto Arts Council, which was a great win for us. And we're just looking to supplement that grant to ensure that we have the proper budget to proceed with the production. And John, like you said, we shot a promo short film. It's called Shinji and Akiko Spend an Afternoon Together. It basically is an introduction to the main character Shinji and one of the other characters, Akiko. And basically, I guess I like to frame it as spending an afternoon with them and seeing who they are, their kind of dynamic, and getting a glimpse at the kind of struggle that Shinji faces. So that's definitely in the promo short film, and people can check that out. And our website has more information about the film and how anyone can support. So I guess that's our plug. Tomo, anything you want to add here?
Thank you very much, John, for this.
Yeah, thank you guys for agreeing to come on. I've enjoyed the conversations that we had even before you came on here, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how the film progresses and excited to see the final product. And I'm sure it's something that's going to really have an impact with anyone who watches. Yeah. So that was part 2 of the interview, and it was really great. I really enjoyed the conversation and getting the opportunity to be interviewed a little bit on my own show. Something doesn't happen too often. So that was nice to get the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And thanks, Tomo, for doing that, for sneaking in, as you said, or as I said, just slipping into the role of interviewer. And it was quite interesting seeing a number of the comments that I shared earlier on, and again from Toronto English School, Joseph sharing that analogy about English and how there is maybe in the cult there's a cultural tendency, I think, in Japan to go for perfection, which can sometimes be a barrier when trying to learn a language, because a lot of it comes through trial and error and making mistakes. And I referenced it. It's funny because I was recently watching a Japanese drama called Doraemon Zakura, which is, I won't get too much into the detail, but the idea is that it's centered around helping students who are high school students who are not particularly good performers to get into Todai, which is the Tokyo University, top university in the country. And they talk about English and getting English ready for preparing their English abilities for the exam. And the idea that, well, if you ask a typical Japanese person if they can speak English, they'll say, oh, no, I can't really speak English at all very well, even if they can. But they said, well, if you ask foreigners who come here if they can speak Japanese, they'll say, yes, I can. I can say sushi and sumo. It's a bit of a stereotype, but depending on the confidence level, and some of that I think comes to some extent from culture as well as personality. So thanks for bringing those up in the comments as well. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, and Tomo confirmed in the chat, that the filming for Good Boy is starting on February 6th. And to find out more about that, you can go to www.goodboyfilmproduction.com to find out more about those opportunities to perhaps be an extra in there, and also about funding, because as was mentioned, they are looking to get additional funding so that they can make sure that the project is complete. There is a link to the GoFundMe page there, as well as the short film that they referenced earlier, which I watched and I mentioned in the first part of the interview last week, that really made a great impression on me. So I encourage you to go there and find out more about the film. So I'm just going to see if there are any comments. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, okay. Yes. Good point, Tomo. Yes, that maybe being shy or humble is somewhat encouraged in Japanese culture too. Yeah, I think that's also quite true as well. Again, my experience being someone as an outsider in Japan, many times I had the experience, even in the golf tournaments that I participated in with the Toronto Shokokai, which is the local Japanese business, chamber of commerce. And I went there, not being particularly good at golf, uh, but I would speak to the others who were there and ask them, oh, I say, well, I'm a beginner. Oh, and they would, of course, say, oh, well, yes, I'm a beginner. I'm a beginner too. I'm a terrible golf player. And of course, they were so much better than me. So we weren't in the same league at all. And I think again, it's kind of that cultural humility. I think you're right. So kind of understating, not wanting to brag about that. And yeah, there's also the contrast between group culture in Japan and individualism in North America. Yes, completely agree there as well. Joseph from Toronto English School, and that's certainly, I think, part of not that tendency to maybe not want to stand out so much. Whereas we're encouraged in Canada and the US in many situations to talk yourself up. And this also comes up when it's job interviews or when you are working in a corporation, that if you want to get opportunities, you need to speak up and talk about yourself. And in some cultures, such as Japan and a number of other cultures, that comes across as negative and bragging. So many newcomers who come here have trouble getting used to that. And many times they can be excellent at their jobs, but because they don't speak up about themselves, they can get stuck in their positions because they never speak up. They don't get that much attention. Managers assume, oh, they must like where they are. And that's a cultural difference, because in their cultures, okay, to advance, you just work and show your value and you don't need to speak about it. And that's one of the things that I intend to cover in that course that I mentioned earlier, which again, I can drop into the chat, although there is a link for the LinkedIn profile for the survey and wait list. So I will just drop that in the chat, though, the description I mentioned earlier. And again, if you have any questions about that course or want to know more about it, please feel free to send me a message either through LinkedIn or through the email. So I have just dropped that in the chat for both YouTube and LinkedIn Live. And of course, this episode will be coming out as an audio podcast episode on Monday on most major podcast platforms. So if you are someone who likes to listen to the show when you're exercising or commuting, there are options there. Please feel free to subscribe and create a review, give a review as well. And of course, there is next week's episode to talk about as well, which we will be having a great interview with Kasia Lynch, who is the founder of Nihongo Jobs and a connector between US and Japan. She's lived in multiple countries, including Poland, Italy, Japan, and the US. In the interview, she talks about her early experiences learning English while in kindergarten in the US, and how her love of learning languages led to her learning Japanese, her experiences feeling like an outsider in many cultures, and how she turned that into the strength and the frustration she felt about not being able to use her Japanese language skills and work that led to her creating Nihongo Jobs in the first place. So that episode is coming up on next week, next Wednesday, at our usual time, live at noon at Eastern Standard Time. So I encourage you to tune in for that. And it's going to be, again, because of that connection, that mutual connection we have in Japan, I think there was a really good interview and sharing some common experiences as well. So looking forward to sharing that with you. So in the meantime, keep navigating between cultures towards your goals. Thank you.